So everyone, welcome to today's SCOTUS Vacancy Forum. We appreciate everybody being here and the interest. My name is Seth Zawilla. I'm a law student involved with the American Constitution Society and the University of Minnesota Law Democrats. But more importantly today, we have Senator Klobuchar and Mr. Mondale, of which our school is named after. So just to kind of give you guys a brief introduction, although I'm sure no intros are needed, Senator Klobuchar sits on the Senate Judiciary Committee in the United States Senate, which has jurisdiction over Supreme Court nominations, and she was sitting on that committee during Justice Kagan and Justice Sotomayor when they went from nominees to being confirmed on the Supreme Court, and she currently sits on that committee today. Mr. Mondale was the 42nd Vice President of the United States under President Jimmy Carter, and he's been in the Senate for 12 years in the 60s, and he has a wealth of experience, and he's also the honorary chair of the American Constitution Society here in the Twin Cities. So today's format, we've already kind of described it to you before we came today. It's going to be a 40-minute forum with me asking questions that students and faculty have for Senator Klobuchar and Mr. Mondale, and then we're going to move on to 20 minutes of question and answer sessions on the Supreme Court topic. So, if I could kind of start off to begin with our event, this question will be for both of you. All right. Let's go with Mr. Mondale then, since
we've got a live politician.
Yeah, we can do it in chronological order. So let's begin.
Oh, you're dictatorial.
When you were in the Senate in the 60s, what was it like to nominate or to look at a Supreme Court justice that was put up for nomination?
First of all, I want to say I'm very glad to be here, and especially with Amy, who's a wonderful, magnificent senator, a seasoned member now of the Judiciary Committee, has been through all of this, and she's in a position to help us better understand this issue that filled this room today. We've got reporters hanging around today. That doesn't happen too often with a law class, but they're here because they know how we can deal with judicial nominations and how we're going to responsibly fill vacancies on our courts, particularly the Supreme Court, is in many ways the top issue of our time. Maybe I could just take 2 minutes to talk about what I went through in those days. We had a fight over Abe Fortas, who was on the Supreme Court, and then Johnson nominated him to be Chief Justice. And during the debate, while his confirmation was pending, the news came out that he was getting something like $20,000 a month under the table from a jailed financier. Well, I consider that a very poor recommendation. So I announced I was not for him. And several others joined me, and they pulled the nomination down. So that was one.
I didn't even know that story.
Well, a lot of this is ancient history.
It's helpful. It's good.
But then Thurgood Marshall, great judge, approved unanimously. Then we had Warren Burger from Minnesota, who he and Gene McCarthy had not gotten along well. McCarthy had been a congressman, and Burger made the mistake of opposing him. So when it was Burger's time to get confirmed, McCarthy wouldn't support him. But he let me support him. So I supported Burger, and I supported Harry Blackmun. We had the two Minnesota Twins there. I supported Lewis Powell, who's a good judge. I voted against Rehnquist because I thought he was too right-wing, too doctrinaire. He was confirmed. John Paul Stevens, I think this may have been after I was vice president. Anyway, that's the story of what we went through. It seems to me that, and we worked with people like Dirksen and Hugh Scott. These were the Republican leaders. And if you'd go to them and talk to them, sometimes they'd say, no, we can't go along. Other times they'd say, yes, we can go along with it, but you got to change this a little bit. Usually, I learned this from Humphrey, You went in there and they said, yes, I'll support it, but you've got to let me be the leader of the bill. So the public thought they'd done all the work. I had done all the work and didn't dare tell anybody. But anyway, we made progress. And they were flexible. They weren't ideological. And one of the things that bothers me, and then I'm going to shut up, but I think that today's nominating and confirmation process has been badly mangled by political inflexibility. That's where you've tried to help unfreeze the system. And I think that I'm right. Not only did the Senate not act on the latest presidential nomination on the ridiculous grounds that presidential nominations have no force in the last year of a president. And this has never been the law, couldn't be the law. You can't read the Constitution and see anything like in there. So we've had an unconfirmed judge there, a nominee, for the better part of a year. And they're now talking about holding up all of Hillary's nominees if she's nominated. I don't know if they mean that, but this is a really dark period, I think, in terms of openness, in terms of flexibility. You know, if you're going to get judges confirmed, if you're going to get some kind of community at work that tries to get good nominees and supports them and has some flexibility in terms of political party, we haven't been doing that. You've been doing it, but the Senate leadership has not been doing that, and I'm worried that we're going to go right into more of that. And with that, I stop.
All right.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for, that wealth of experience. For Senator Klobuchar sitting in the Senate today, what is your experience of looking at Supreme Court nominees and deciding whether to give consent?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having us to this great law school, to the law school where I know the students know that the Constitution doesn't say the Senate will advise and consent except during an election year. Appreciate that. You wouldn't be going to the Mondale School if you didn't know your words from the Constitution. And I also wanted to thank Vice President Mondale for his incredible life of service. I actually got to intern for him. That was my first job in Washington, where I was assigned. I thought I went there all bright-eyed. I was going to do all this policy work. And his people assigned me to doing the furniture inventory. And I had to literally crawl under every desk and chair and write the serial numbers down for 3 weeks. And I learned two things from that experience. One is that he is and was a very honest man. Nothing was missing. And the second, and I tell all of you this, if you have summer jobs that maybe aren't your perfect summer job or your first job that's not your perfect job, take those jobs very seriously, because that was my first job in Washington, and this was my second. Okay? All right, so on to this incredibly important topic, and I think we'll talk about the current opening later in Merrick Garland, and I thought I'd go to the nub of the first part of the question, which the Vice President answered, which was what these hearings were like and what has happened. And I actually believe there's a lot of people every time we have one of these hearings that says, oh, we don't need these hearings, they're such a show thing, they're so stupid, they don't answer any questions. I still think they're very important for the public at a time of distrust in government, distrust in all institutions, that the nominee for the highest court of the land have to appear in public and answer questions, even if they don't answer all the questions like you'd like them to or with much detail. One, they have to prepare for those hearings. Two, it allows senators to ask them questions even leading up to the hearings that they may not ask in public. And three, you get to see what they know and how they carry themselves. And I still think it's important. I don't really think that the last 2 days of the hearing or the last day is very important. Many of you may not have seen those days. Those are the ones I get to chair. They are the ones where the nominees' friends come in, and then people who are just completely opposed to them testify, interest groups, and it's really absurd. At one point, Sonia Sotomayor, in response, they had a guy in that said that she would make all her decisions based on foreign law. And I was chairing it with Jeff Sessions, and he asked if he could ask a rebuttal question, and I said, only if you don't ask it in French. And it was very absurd. And she actually had someone she knew from middle school or elementary school who I asked for a joke, well, what was she like in elementary school? And he, in all seriousness, said, very judicious. I do find those to be somewhat of a mockery, but I do think that day of hearing from the nominee themselves is really important. And I think both Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan did a stellar job in their hearings. I think what most marked those hearings was the fact that while the votes have become more partisan, for each nominee they did get Republican votes. Lindsey Graham in particular was willing to stand up and say, look, John McCain is my best friend, and I would not have picked these two nominees, but my duty is to figure out whether or not they are capable and prepared to serve as a Supreme Court justice. And he said, without a doubt, they are. And he voted for both of them. So there were a number of people that did that, and I took a lot of solace in that. The hearings themselves were actually pretty civil. Yeah, there are some moments here and there, but they're pretty civil. People asked somewhat normal questions, and I think it's pretty important. And some of the more interesting parts of those two hearings were the fact that both, here they are two women, the first Latino woman. Sotomayor had more experience on the bench as a judge than anyone that had ever been nominated in terms of the breadth of the hearings that she had conducted, and yet she was criticized, if anyone remembers this, for not just the empathy and not just, she was criticized for being too tough as a judge. And I remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who we've since learned can be a bit outspoken, saying at the time to the New York Times at a perfectly timed interview, well, have you ever seen Breyer and Scalia on the bench? And so I think her point was, come on, sure she can be tough on litigants. So that was a memorable moment. And then for both of those women, there were only one other woman on the whole Judiciary Committee, and that was Dianne Feinstein and myself. And so I did a whole bunch of TV and spoke for them because, as you know, they don't do TV. And I literally had memorized their resume to the point where Sonia Sotomayor's mother thanked me for repeatedly telling the story of how she bought her encyclopedias when they were young. So you really learn a lot about it when you're on the committee, and that may be a little different in terms of the media focus on some of these, the cable being constant, and you constantly need people to speak for them when attacks are made. And there always were, of course, attacks, but this becomes a 24-hour cycle about the nominee for a number of weeks and their decisions in past cases. Elena Kagan, of course, was attacked for not having any judicial experience, but she was so smart and was the Solicitor General of the United States and again did very well. And probably my most moment I will never forget was from that hearing. I had a bunch of second questions round I was going to ask. I put together a committee of people from our state, and they helped me to come up with some questions. And of course, I had counsel coming up with questions. But my counsel at the time, Paige Herwig, who's now one of Loretta Lynch's top people, she and I were sitting there, and I was ready to go on some Times v. Sullivan question, which I eventually asked, and some other things. And Tom Coburn was in front of me, and he started just harassing her about whether or not we were more free 30 years ago. And his whole point was that we were more free 30 years ago. And I was like, where did 30 years ago? I'm thinking 1980 when we had to wear bow ties and I was in love. So I literally, with 5 minutes, turned to Paige and I said, what was the most popular song 30 years ago? She did all this research, so in 5 minutes. And I said, I have a question to follow up on Senator Coburn. 30 years ago, back when we wore bow ties, what was the most popular song? Of course, Elena Kagan says, I have no idea. And I said, it was Blondie, Call Me. 30 years ago, how many women were on the Supreme Court? She says, none. And I said, 30 years ago, how many women were on this committee? And she says, I don't know. And I say, none. And I said, 30 years ago, how many women were in the United States Senate? And she says, I'm not sure, and I think the answer was 1. And I said, freedom is in the eye of the beholder. And then I went on and asked my question. And there were some really good questions asked by Democrats and Republicans, so I won't go on about this, but just to make a pitch, I think these hearings are important. I think we got 2 justices that were good out of it, and I think a number of Republicans, while they should have voted for it, didn't, but there were a number that were took their duty very seriously, and we were able to get over the 60-vote threshold and get them done, and they're on the Supreme Court. So I do think the process can work. I don't think it's working now.
Well, so I guess turning to today's set of events, when you heard about Justice Scalia's passing, when you heard about the nomination process opening up, what were your first thoughts? Did you first think, without kind of immediately when you heard the news, did you first think that that seat would be filled in President Obama's second term?
Yes, I certainly did. I mean, I think everyone was shocked that Justice Scalia had died. He was such a vibrant member of the court and well-loved by the other justices, and it was a real shock. And I remember thinking, well, there'll be a big celebration of his life, there'll be a funeral, I remember that. So, and then an hour or two later, we started hearing comments from spokespeople and McConnell's office eventually saying that they didn't think that there should be hearings. And I was like, that's just wrong. Some spokesperson is out of hand. It's me. And that, of course, has been what happened. So that was, it came almost immediately after his death that we started hearing about this, that we didn't think that there should be hearings. There wasn't even an openness to the idea that the president would nominate someone that could be acceptable, which he did nominate someone that in the past has been acceptable. And so that's my biggest memory of that time, was just the shock that they were immediately saying that right afterward. I guess it was a sign of things to come.
Yeah. What about you, Mr. Mondale? What were your thoughts?
I thought it was outrageous when they said a presidential nomination would not even have a hearing. I think the Constitution says the president shall nominate, and the committee shall advise and consent. They're going to do something there anyway. They can say no, they can say yes, but they can't do anything, which is what the Republican leadership demanded and enforced of the Senate. Not only weren't they going to have hearings, the Senate Judiciary Committee members on the Republicans, they were not going to meet with him and the nominee, not even give him any patina of having been nominated, which is an official step in the Constitution. And to me, it was a signal. It was a signal that there was a new era of tough, arbitrary partisanship that had taken over at the leadership level. This is the same guy that said that he was going to spend his time as leader making certain that Obama would not be reelected as president. There's a book that just came out about him, not very flattering, about how tough and kind of unbending that he is. And so now we go into this, we don't know what's going to happen in this election. How many are going to vote? Raise your hands. Who didn't raise your hand? In any event, be sure to participate. But it looks like Hillary will be elected. It looks like there's more than a 50-50 chance that the Democrats will take over the Senate. Probably not much of a chance we'll change leadership in the House. But what that means is that while we have made progress, we have a new president and a new Senate voted by the public, the Senate rules allows the leadership to require 60 votes under the Rule 22, the filibuster rule. And if they're hard over on that, what it means is that none of the presidential nominees can get confirmed unless they have unusual drawing power in the Senate, or unless the leadership of the Republican leadership will bend. That would be a hell of a way to kick off a new 4-year presidency. I hope they don't do that. I hope it used to be what we called honeymoon period, when if you did things early enough and graciously enough, you could get something done. So maybe they'll do that. I don't think they will. I think they're going to be hard over. I think they're going to try to drive Hillary into the ground. I think the idea that the U.S. Supreme Court would have what I call balanced, moderate judges is a scary concept to them, and they won't bend. But we'll find out.
Yeah, well, so I guess, I mean, kind of to go further, you know, with you, Senator Klobuchar, how is the mood coming from your colleagues? Because you work with your GOP colleagues every day. I mean, did you notice that, you know, all of them kind of formulated in lockstep around this position that, you know, the Majority Leader McConnell came up with? Or, you know, were there any kind of private frustrations with the way that the GOP is conducting business right now with this blockade?
Well, yes, and there were actually some public disagreements. Both Senator Collins and Senator Kirk asked for hearings. Interestingly enough, Senator Moran in Kansas asked for a hearing in front of several journalists in his own state, and then there was so much pushback while he was in his primary and threats of putting money in against him that he literally turned his position in a week and said that there shouldn't be a hearing. So if that's not a clue for why we need to overturn Citizens United or pass a constitutional amendment, I don't know what is. He said very clearly he thought we should have a hearing. He didn't know if he'd vote for him, but we should have a hearing. And then that's what happened. So those were the three instances. Recently, Senator Grassley in a town hall meeting said, well, maybe if people talk to me about it, maybe I'll do it in the lame duck. And then Senator Flake has been very clear that he thinks that there should be a hearing in the lame duck. And to me, they have said some things privately, but a lot of this has to do with the outside money and a decision that was made. And it's very sad. I've had to ask myself, well, what would I do if we had the opposite? If we had a Republican president and a Democratic Senate, like they did when Anthony Kennedy was confirmed in the last year of Reagan's presidency. And I have said publicly, I would certainly call for a hearing. Depending on the nominee, I would decide if I would vote for them or not. But I would think that we should have a hearing and an up or down vote. And in fact, history bears this out. You go back to 1916 when they started to have hearings. We've had a hearing in every single case except for, I think, 10 or 11 of them when they were confirmed in less than 10 days. And that's a fact. And we've had over a dozen of them confirmed in election years. And we have had them confirmed through World War I and World War II and through the Depression and through 9/11 time period. We've always been able to get that job done. And that's what's so sad about this. Now, I have a little more hope than the vice president. Well, I guess he does. He's just leaving it open. It's just like that this will happen. I'm not certain about the lame duck. I think that would be the best thing to do for everyone as we move forward. But I think that they will have to move forward with this. It may not have been the sexiest election year issue this year. I do think it's hurt some people who've taken that position. And there's a good chance we're going to take back the Senate. But I think that we will have a hearing and that we will get a justice.
Wouldn't that be a little strange for the Republican leadership, which has slapped us all with the back of their hand, wouldn't even let us say hello to the presidential nominee, to suddenly turn around and say, now that Hillary's elected, oh yes, let's confirm his judge. Isn't that?
It is, but weirder things have happened in Congress, and I mean,
I'm looking for stability.
Okay, I would bet that it wouldn't happen in the lame duck, but I think it still could. So that's where I am on that. I don't think you can predict it with all the things that we have to get done. The other reason I think it could happen was a number of them in the past have liked and supported this nominee. A number of them have. A number of them haven't said they would definitely be against him, right? So that's a factor that I look at. One time when he was up for the D.C. court, Senator Hatch actually gave a speech on the floor and challenged other senators to come forward and say anything bad about Merrick Garland. He is the prosecutor who oversaw the Oklahoma City bombing case, the Unabomber case. He's well-liked. He's a consensus builder. He's done a lot with Justice Roberts. There's a lot of reasons to think that perhaps they would either move forward in the lame duck or whether or not we take over the Senate. I personally think we will move forward into the next year. And I just want to make one point about the filibuster issue. As you know, when it comes to judges and ambassadors and administrative appointees, we actually no longer have the 60-vote threshold except for the Supreme Court. And I think there's a lot of sentiment to try to keep that in place as a sort of cooling factor on both parties if either party dominated a chamber. And that, of course, will only work if it works. It only works if both parties allow nominees to go forward. And then if that doesn't happen and we start to have a constitutional crisis, and we've already had 7-4-4 decisions and 5 of them tied and 2 of them remanded on such important topics as immigration and contraception and housing. I mean, at some point it will reach a point where you couldn't keep that 60-vote threshold in place. So it really is a critical moment in time, as the Vice President has noted.
I spent a lot of my career fighting around Rule 22. It used to be 2/3, 66 votes. You couldn't get anything done unless you had most everybody with you before it started. And I came in, and we finally got a senator from Alabama who was mad at Lincoln for freeing the slaves, and he wanted to kill everything that wasn't his idea of Deep South politics.
But just to clarify, you weren't there at that time.
Yes, sir.
I
was just getting.
I just wanted that.
I was just getting started.
Okay, good.
Senator Allen was there.
Right, exactly.
And so he was blocking everything. So I put together a resolution. I got some support, and we went out on the floor, and I beat him. And it
was amazing.
I walked the number back needed for cloture from 67 to 60. Mm-hmm. And I was hoping, and that did work for a while. It gave you you had a hill that you had to climb. You had to debate issues, and the other side could hold you up some, and I think it was pretty healthy. Mm-hmm. And then, like the rest of society, we became so hard over that even the 60 thing became almost impossible. So then the last time I testified on this, I said, why don't we change the rule to, say, 55? What I'm trying to do is get the same balance. So we went to 50 for judges other than the Supreme Court, but it's still 60 for other issues.
And other issues on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and I think it's 67 on rules change. In any event, I'd like to see the rule liberalized some more to try to head off the harshness and still get the debate and then finally let the Senate be heard. I don't think it'll happen, but I think it should be tried.
How do you think institutional memory plays in this, and particularly, I guess, for the GOP conference? Because as you guys are referencing, in 2013, in the face of unprecedented judicial vacancies in the federal judiciary, the Senate in control with the Democratic conference moved to make it a simple yes/no or majority vote for those nominations, at a big kind of fanfare and upset on the GOP side. Do you think that kind of frustration plays into the calculus at all for the Republicans when they're figuring out their moves and how they want to strategically make their hand in the Senate?
No, and I'm smiling because they then took over the Senate and they kept it in place. Yeah. Okay, because they didn't want to have to take those votes for Obama nominees to go over 51. They knew they couldn't just put sand in the gears for the entire 2 years they were there, and the 51 votes made it easier. So a few of sometimes still people go through nearly unanimously or unanimously. Yeah. It happens more often than you think, just for positions you may not know about. But a lot of them, they didn't want to have to be there on the Loretta Lynch nomination and give 10 votes or something like that. So they actually, despite being in charge, kept that in place. So I don't think they're going to care about that. I think there are still a number of them that want to keep, like a number of our members do, the 60 vote on the Supreme Court. We could maybe change the number some. And I don't think there's a lot of sentiment to change that. What would be nice, what the Vice President was talking about, was with legislation to make some changes there, to move it along, to not have, also you could do it where you wouldn't have to have several votes in a row that take up so much time, which slows things down. But I am, my entire goal here is that we need to get a justice on the court, someone that's capable, and I continue to believe there's a chance of getting it done, maybe not in the lame duck, but right away in January, because of the fact that we have so many cases. There was a death penalty case that was 4-4. There's just a number of things going on. They're not taking certain cases. The courts are, there's now guidance from the courts on what to do. And it just, as bad as things are in Washington some days, and there's a lot better things going on than people know, as the Vice President pointed out, with a new president starting, you don't want this hanging over us for an entire year, our democracy, basically, because that's what this is about. It's really about the future of our democracy, and if they keep doing this, it's just going to be the Trump campaign for another year, and I'm hoping they don't do that.
If I can just say one thing. I think that the role of Supreme Court justice is so profound in the law and in American life that there should be a requirement that a debate can be held if somebody wants one. There should be some number above, say, 50 or 55 votes that a nominee has to get to be confirmed. Otherwise, it's just a slick 50 vote, and you know it's different. It's just different. When somebody has to get a large number of votes, like 60, it gets the attention of the Senate and the senators, unlike these routine 50 votes. So I hope we keep something special for judges. Mm-hmm. We had some real bummers when I was there.
You see why I think we maybe want to keep some numbers. Those bummers don't get through.
Yeah, you mostly. But we had, here were their names here, 2 judges that were sent up for confirmation. We turned them both down, Clement Haynesworth and Carswell. This was Nixon's idea of moving toward the New South as he saw it. And these were 2 Southern judges who had some spotty civil rights votes. And it really set off a big debate in the Senate. And before it was over, both of them were turned down. And I think, and then that's when they got the 2 Minnesotans in to save the court. Mm-hmm. But I think that change was important. I think that debate was important.
Right.
I don't think that picking any judge, but especially justice of the Supreme Court, should be routine whatsoever.
Right. Yeah. And I agree, and I think that's why we're still holding on to this idea of using the 60 votes. But as you can imagine, if it goes on and on and on, and when even someone as moderate as Merrick Garland's put up and you can't get someone on, and if we take over the Senate and they're still stalling it with the 60 votes, then you have to step back and look at it again, because you can't go on for years this way. And that's why I think that it will move forward. And again, we don't know who, if it doesn't happen in the lame duck, we don't know who Secretary Clinton will pick as the other.
Well, so in the next, I'll stop talking. But in the next 4 years, there are going to be 2 or 3 federal Supreme Court justices that may come up. So this could be a continuing set of challenges for us.
Yeah. So I guess the last question before we move into the Q&A session. So I mean, it sounds like you're pretty optimistic that this is more of a fluke kind of moving forward. Hopefully that, you know, with this,
yeah,
with this,
at me like, yeah, right.
with this,
I know.
with this nomination, or do you see it becoming more and more politicized, more and more difficult to get Supreme Court nominees?
It's going to be
on the
interesting.
bench?
I think some of this depends on what happens on Election Day and what kind of numbers that Secretary Clinton brings in, because I think she is forecast to win now by like 93%. I think that could make a difference for how people will respond, not necessarily to her, but to this idea of obstruction rhetoric and what happens when you do that. If we take back the Senate, even though this will clearly not be the major reason we'd win back the Senate, it would be a reason in some of these states, like say New Hampshire, where it's been a bigger deal to some of the voters that are more used to things working. Wisconsin, they're kind of used to having a democracy that works and putting judges in place. So some of the states, it resonates more than other states. So I think that will be a difference in how we look at it going forward. And then I just think there are some things that are so big on our agenda that can be more bipartisan. Immigration reform, we have such an opportunity to get that done. We'd already passed a strong bill in the Senate with bipartisan support. Tax reform with trillions of dollars overseas. That's going to be a huge fight about how to do that. But if we can find that right ground where we're able to encourage the money to come back and still put a bunch of the money into infrastructure, and you got minimum wage and the student loans and a number of other things, that it makes me think that there's room here for a big year to get things done, and people are not going to want the whole year dominated by a Supreme Court hearing. I just don't buy it. And if I'm wrong, he and I will come back in a year, and he will go like this. Okay, so let's see. Should we plan on doing that?
Yeah, well, let's see.
Okay, and then I will go. But that's what I think. I think that now a second nominee. I mean, I don't know how long that would take, but I think this first one. Again, depending on what she does, and another nominee would perhaps get done too, probably not as quickly, but I think that they will have to get it done, even if they have a bare minimum in the Senate, which I think is not going to happen.
All right, well, we'll have to see what the future holds, and hopefully, you know, you guys don't have to be back here next year talking about the next or the same Supreme Court nomination. Yeah. So we're going to move to the Q&A session now. So we have a microphone here in the center with two of our volunteers going to be handling it. And so if you guys could keep the questions to be Supreme Court vacancy questions, we'd appreciate that, and then just quick and concise so we can make sure that the student body has questions. So if you have a question, you want to walk up to the microphone in the middle of this aisle here. And then if you could, I guess, direct it to either Mr. Mondale or Senator Klobuchar for us.
Thank you for being here. This is a question for both of you. We're talking a lot about Democrats who are taking the Senate, Hillary Clinton, winning the presidency, fingers crossed. But if there were a nightmare scenario where Donald Trump were to win...
this is called a loaded question.
No,
it's not a political
if he were to win and Republicans were to keep the Senate and he were to appoint someone, would you similarly still be supportive of reducing the number to 55 or 50 as a general principle, or do you think in that case it'd be more safe to keep it around 60?
Yeah, and I'll let Vice President, who was such a leader on this, quickly go after me. But again, I would prefer to keep it at 60 for Supreme Court. I'm open to going a little lower. But as I said, and I would do that no matter who's in charge, because you can't. That's why the Republicans are careful on this, and that's why we're careful, because of what it could mean in the future. But if this goes on, this is not just being pragmatic. I think it's not being overly dramatic. We can't have a constitutional crisis. So then if this goes on, then we'll have to go down to some lower number if we are in charge of the Senate. That's what we'll have to do. And then that number will stay in place for the next one or the next two justice. And then they know that that means that we will have much more power over who gets nominated. And they will have much less say in who that person is. And that's the risk they'll take.
Your question is always asked because they're trying to uncover hypocrisy. In other words, you're for the tight rules when the other side is in charge, and you're for looser rules when you're in charge. That doesn't work. You've got to live by the rules you've set up. Right now it's 60. I think you're right. Let's see what happens now. That could be That could work with the judges. If not, we may have to change it. But if you change it, you have to live with that. It's not just a Democratic or Republican rule, it's a Senate rule.
Mm-hmm. And I was ready to, with the 51 votes on the ambassadors and the president's, I mean, those are big votes. Attorney General, it's now all 51 votes. Mm-hmm. And so once you're willing to concede that, you know you're going to do that if you have a Republican president as well. And I think a lot of the senators said this is ridiculous. We'll be able to weed out bad eggs. We'll be able to weed out people that we're really concerned about by public pressure. But a president should be able to put in their ambassadors and their... Now, that doesn't mean they haven't been messing around certain people like Senator Cruz, not to mention names, with delaying ambassadors like the Norwegian and Swedish ones over no good reason. But still, once you get the vote, once you get the vote, then you get them done. So.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, good, thanks. Sorry, I thought you were going to ask another one.
No. My question is mostly for Senator Klobuchar. If Hillary Clinton does win and the Democrats do retake the Senate, but the Republicans don't push through Garland and the lame duck, do you think it's more likely that in the 20 or so days that we have both the new Congress and Obama, that they'll push through Garland?
Yeah, I don't know. That would require them to do a lot of work between the senator's swearing-in day and the inauguration. That's an interesting question. That's what my husband always was wondering is going to happen. And he's a law professor, so I have a feeling that that's not what happened. I think that, let's say we had some kind of a hearing in the lame duck, then they would just do the whole thing in the lame duck. They would do the hearing really fast. They would argue, well, he's gotten all this stuff in. We're just going to have a day hearing here and get this done. I seriously doubt they'll do it in that moment, although that would save them the embarrassment of the fact that they'd said they wouldn't do it in the lame duck. If you remember, a number of them have said that, so they would be going back on their word. So I suppose it's possible. It's just such a short period of time because senators that aren't on the committee have to look at what happened and the questions. I think it would be sort of not as possible, but you never know.
Again, thank you both for coming out. I'd like to get both of your perspectives on this. Is there value to a president imposing a litmus test on potential Supreme Court nominees?
That's always argued.
You ran for president.
Yeah,
so
I did.
that would be good. I mean, I'm sure you've been asked that question.
I did, and I was asked that question. I made it clear that I wouldn't have nominated anybody who had a bad civil rights record, who didn't stand up for some kind of sense of decency toward women and others, that I believed in civil liberties and we needed a court. So I did. I defined in broad terms what I'd be looking for if I had been the president. Some people criticized that. They said you shouldn't lay out any guidelines. I don't see what's wrong with the president defining it in that way. I don't think you should pick someone, but I think the public should know what you're thinking about when you look for a judge. So that's the way I attacked it.
I would look at it more as precedent. You know, how have they respected precedent? Have they respected Roe v. Wade in their judicial decisions, or in Merrick Garland's case? Actually, he's never made a decision in that realm. But so you look at the fact. How have they respected precedent in certain areas, or have they just gone off in one political bent that I wouldn't agree with the way they interpreted it? So I wouldn't say there's one litmus test, but you look at how they respect the precedent that's on the books right now.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
This question is for both Senator Klobuchar and Vice President Mondale. Thank you for coming here. I was a member of the White House's vetting team in 2009 and 2010 when Justices Sotomayor and Kagan were picked. And my question is, as vetters, part of our job was to find problems with any candidate's history. And I think Judge Garland has a very safe history, so to speak. But how do you weigh a nomination when you can't really tell what exactly their views on issues are, if they're playing it close to the vest?
Well, I think you look at their record as a whole, and you're able to tell in Merrick Garland's case that, in my mind, that he has carefully applied the law, that he has, I mean, you can kind of see trends. He's been a little more conservative when it comes to security cases and things like that. Seems to have really thought through decisions and based them on the facts. He's certainly qualified. I like to look at the respect he has from the people that he works with, who are in those rooms with him, in a Hamilton fashion, in the room. It took a little while, but and so in the room where it happened, so to say. So you get that sense of them. I just don't look at one thing. And I have voted for judges in the Senate that I wouldn't agree with every position that they've taken. That's for sure. But I try to look at it overall, and you sort of look at a balance of things. Is how far does that balance tip? So. I think that you want to give a judge the ability to look at a case not just based on a political view, but on how they would apply the precedent. A little more old-fashioned than some people about that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yep.
Hi. So, when you say, like, if it gets bad, maybe we have to, isn't it already kind of bad? Like, they're
well, no.
I just feel like it's sort of, we've heard a number of times, like, oh, if President Obama wins in 2012, the fever will break. Maybe the Republicans will become reasonable and do things for the right reasons, and they kind of haven't. So I'm wondering if we're not going to think about changing the filibuster rule, what kind of structural reforms might actually, rather than trust them to do the right thing, kind of get them to participate in the process.
Okay, so a few things. Number one, when I said when it gets bad, I'm not implying that it's not bad. I was the one there that on the night of the fiscal cliff vote was when we voted until 3 a.m, had the unfortunate experience of New Year's Eve at midnight, standing on the Senate floor, that magical moment of midnight on New Year's Eve, looking to my left and seeing Harry Reid, and looking to my right and seeing Mitch McConnell. Every girl's dream on New Year's Eve. So I know I am not being a Pollyanna about the fact that it's not an easy place right now. But that being said, we have, through very civil hearings, gotten through 2 Supreme Court nominees that were the president's first choices. And that happened. You can't deny that happened. We happened to be in charge when that happened, but it happened. And we've also been able to get a budget this last year and things, in part because the election was coming up. I think people didn't want to look like they were shutting the government down again. But we were able to get through that time. I think the frustration has been that we've been governing through crisis, right? We got the stimulus bill, we got the TARP bill, we got the Dodd-Frank bill done, and now we have this opportunity, of which you're part of, with the country being in a much more stable and expanding economic situation. And we should be governing from opportunity and not messing around with fighting over clearly qualified nominees for the Supreme Court that we're supposed to advise and consent on, and shouldn't be messing around with stopping things like immigration reform. So that's what I think this time period is about. So when I said if they get really bad, it has been bad, but I mean about this particular Supreme Court hearing. I believe that this is not an issue that they're going to want to be hanging around on for 2 years, that they're going to want to look like they actually can get this done, especially if we resoundingly win the presidency, which I think is going to happen. And if we do well in the Senate, either take it back, or if we take it back, even if it's by a narrow margin, get closer in the House, that is a clear referendum on one style of governing. And so that's why I have a little more hope we'll get it done. And I want to keep the 60 votes because I don't want to see the pendulum swing the other way. And then, if we can't get it done, we will go down from the 60 votes if we're in control. Trust me, that will happen.
I agree with Amy's answer there. I would like to say that I believe that this change that happened in America starting 20 or 25 years ago, where the 2 parties got rigid and started snarling at each other, and every issue became a train wreck. It really is first of all, it sort of disgraces America in the eyes of the world. We can't get anything done. I think it's outrageous. And I don't think we're going to find the answer slowly in the Senate rules. I think there has to be a public decision to tell public office holders to get off it and to start behaving like adult people and start solving these things and serving their country. I think if we don't start, that's what the polls show the public thinks now. This is disgraceful. They can see it. But it doesn't seem to show up yet in politics. This is not, I'm not talking as a Democrat or Republican now. I'm talking as an American who is deeply hurt by the consequences of this arbitrary approach to politics. So I hope no one gets hurt more by this than the next generation. And I'm told the polls show that young people don't agree with this at all. They want to get stuff done. So maybe if you go get elected, vote this time, you can help make a difference. Because I think a lot of the answer here has to be in the political realm.
Okay.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you both so much for coming. The Supreme Court historically has not been known as a particularly diverse place, however you interpret that. With this vacancy, it's an opportunity to diversify the court. If Hillary Clinton is elected, would you want to see a more diverse candidate than Merrick Garland?
I really think that's going to be up to the president. I think whether it's for this nomination or another, I think you're going to see an increasing diversity of the court. You've already seen now we have 3 women on the court when we had none. We have a Hispanic on the court for the first time. We have 1 African American on the court. I would think you'll see increasing diversity. I don't know if you'll see it in which nominee, but as the Vice President mentioned, there's going to be 2 or 3 openings on the court, and there are a lot of good candidates out there who've worked their way up in the circuit courts and the district courts. I'm not going to name names because then I'll get in trouble.
No, I agree with what the Senator just said. We've done pretty well with women on the court. We have a black judge, but he's against civil rights. How they found him? No, that literally, he only asks a question every 10 years. And, you know, so it's not just the color of a judge. We got to know what's standing behind it, don't you think?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Thank you. Very good. Next question.
Hi. I have a question for both of you. As 2 people who have considered and examined nominees for the Supreme Court in the past, do you find there are any qualities in a Supreme Court nominee that are more interesting or pressing to you than in nominees for other judicial positions that might come in front of the Senate?
Would you start with
Go
that?
first. Okay. Well, I think they're somewhat similar because you have to look at every judge seriously, and you really want to make sure they have experience. Although I will say, when I think of those federal district court judges, and we're actually going to have 2 openings here that Senator Franken and I have put together a committee. You guys are a little young, sorry, but to fill. And whenever I think of those federal district court judges, honestly, I think about all the trials they have to do, and that is a major set of skills. Either you want someone that's done trials, or that has been a judge somewhere else, or has been participated in a lot of courtroom activity. And so the Supreme Court, while you most likely want those same skills because they're going to be hearing these cases, there is something bigger about that job. You clearly want someone who's a big thinker and can look at all the precedent and sift through it and make decisions. And you're going to look at that person more carefully. All of the senators do, because they're filling the highest court of the land. So I see it as kind of a continuum, and I do sometimes I might look at a circuit court judge background a little different than I would a district court judge, because I think about that district court judge sitting there alone conducting all those trials, and it's a little bit different than what you might look at. And so you might, on a district court level, maybe even think differently about a view they have on an issue or a case they decided, because the job is a little less about that. than it is on the Supreme Court. So I can't think of some specific examples, except maybe some district court judges that had taken some pretty conservative rulings that I voted for. And I'm not sure I would vote for them as they went up, but I voted for them for district court, mostly because I also value not having judicial openings all the time. And so I think it just varies, but it tends to be a very similar calculation. It's just more high profile.
I agree.
This is going so well.
This will have to be our last question. We've got about 2 minutes left.
Oh, but there's one guy right behind it, or one woman. Well, we're not going to cut off the woman.
Yeah, sure. You want to go up, Macy?
No, I think that you both can answer.
We'll take both then. We'll just try to be considerate of the senators and Mr. Mondale's time.
We're still kind of in a minority in the power and stuff.
That's very gracious.
Thank you.
Traditionally, judicial appointments have been considered to be insulated from political and election processes. But with this recent push to wait until the next president is elected, we've made this judicial appointment significantly more political and therefore more election-based. How do you feel about that sort of pressure on the judicial appointments process?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like that pressure. I came out of a legal background. I actually worked with him at Dorsey and Whitney and Gray Plant Moody. They both had a lot of Democrat, Republican. Then I went to the county attorney's office. It wasn't even, while you got endorsed, it wasn't even partisan on the ballot. And it was county lawyers and workers that have been there through many different county attorneys, and that's just been, I've had a different view of the law based on those experiences than some of my colleagues have. So it really does concern me. In Merrick Garland, however, as I sat in the Rose Garden and watched him be nominated and the president talk about him and saw a tear roll down his cheek, I thought to myself, not only does he have this burden of being nominated for this highest court of the land and wanting to answer all the questions and do the right thing, which he has done, but he also has a burden of what you're talking about, of an independent judiciary on his shoulders, to stand there knowing that people had already, before he was even named, as my friend Angus King, the independent senator from Maine, said, what are people afraid of, that they'll like him too much? But he had the burden, which he has carried well, of going forward to carry this simple concept that it should be divorced from politics. So I think that is going to be important and why he was appealing as a nominee from the president.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. First off, I appreciate you allowing me to ask a question. Thank you. But for both of y'all, we've seen how the 24-hour news cycle has really changed the nature of politics. There's sort of this sense of politicians become these really heightened versions of public figures. And my question is whether you see that happening to the judiciary as things like the RBG tumblers come up and you see, more Supreme Court.
I was going to fake it.
So sorry. No, it's a Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
You take that part.
No. It's a Ruth Bader Ginsburg is RBG,
okay.
And she has become like this cult figure to the point where my daughter would only accompany me to a fancy dinner. Well, later found out because she could get her picture taken with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she cut me out of the photo for Facebook. Okay, now continue on. Yeah.
I remember when she was here.
Yeah.
How many of you heard
Yeah.
her? She's magnificent. I really admire
she's
her.
really good.
Yeah, but so if the so if sort of this trend of having judges becoming part of popular culture with the 24-hour news cycle and constantly under scrutiny, if that's driving the politicalization of the judiciary, or if you think it's something else at work.
I think. Go ahead. No, you go.
Please,
you go. No, please, because I sort of embarrassed you about the.
No,
that you are. Could you
that
believe that he's 88 years old? Okay, let's hear this. I think I want to be like him when I'm that old, because it's incredible how much you know. So you go.
I think this whole issue is deeper than this frivolous thing of people having fun and so on. This is really fundamentally harming our country. It's damaged what the word justice means, which brings us together to try to make certain that we are fair and we're law-abiding. It imperils chances for reform and progress, because if there are no fundamental rules that you can count on, it's just a alley fight from day to day. It demoralizes citizens. We see this stuff go on. We say, well, a lot of kids say politics doesn't count, doesn't make any difference, so I'm not going to be involved. That's how some countries in Europe and elsewhere have lost their democracy, because they first cheapened it, so it had no value, and they snuffed it out for some strong person. You've got to really worry about that. And I think we should be fundamentally, deeply worried about the status and the quality and the strength of American commitment to liberty and justice. That sounds like a 4th of July speech, but I think that's where we are now.
Mm-hmm. And no, I think it's just more of the modern times. In the old days, maybe people weren't aware of the personalities of people in power, and that's just become a bigger deal. I don't think it's bad that Justice Breyer goes out and gives talks. In fact, I think in the old days he probably just gave them to smaller elite groups, so these justices would do it, and then that would mean they were okay. In today's society, the fact that he's out doing a TV interview on a late night talk show, or that Sonia Sotomayor was here at the university walking around shaking everyone's hands, or that Elena Kagan and Scalia went hunting and everyone knew about it. Before they would never know about it, and a woman would never have been going hunting with Justice Scalia. So I don't really view these things, I don't view them as necessarily negatives. I think what Sonia Sotomayor said when she was here at the university at Northrop, and the vice president and I were there, she said, look, it's important for people to understand us and know us. And for her, that means, doing the ball at Times Square, but it also means the fact that she's a role model. So there's a lot of people in leadership today, like my friend Cory Booker that I was just with. They have an obligation that they carry, and many of them do it very well, where they know that they're a role model or the precedent for other kids of color running, or for Latina, Hispanic girls thinking I can do anything I want. So, I think that's what she's more talking about. I think that's what's happening. Or Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a signal for you can grow old and be very cool, which is a perfect way to end.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today.